We're a Crown corporation, so we're an arm's length kind of agency involved in heritage in the province. We started doing intangible cultural heritage in 2008, and it still looks like it's loading. So I'd say for ease, we'll just use the slides kind of on the smaller screen, and we can click down through them if that's okay.
Okay.
So first off, I'm just going to touch a little bit on what is intangible cultural heritage. So for our second slide, I'm just, in case anybody doesn't really know what ICH is, Jonathan, if you just want to go to the second slide when you have a chance.
Okay. Sorry.
It's okay. You can just click the...
I don't know where it all went.
All right. Okay.
Okay. Sorry, folks. Let me bring it back up again.
So while that's happening, I can still talk about what intangible cultural heritage is. It's also known as living heritage, or oftentimes in Newfoundland and Labrador, where there's been kind of a folklore department and some knowledge around folklore, we'll also often call it folklore, as there's kind of this already built-in knowledge about what living heritage or folklore is in the province. So it's both traditional and contemporary. So we like to say that folklore is in and of itself. If it's not living and it's not continuing, then it kind of dies. So it has to be dynamic. It has to be living. So it's both traditional. It's kind of passed down through traditional skills and knowledge, but it's also continues to be revived and living. So that's why it's still known and moving today. It's also inclusive. So it contributes to our sense of identity. Certainly in a lot of parts of Newfoundland and Labrador, there is this kind of sense of identity that's built through those traditional things in the community. And we're going to talk about what some of those traditional things are and why it's important to kind of capture those. When we say representative, we mean that it's passed on from community members. So it's something that's it's passed on from generation to generation, and it's also usually very regional. So mummering, for example, which is a type of custom in Newfoundland and Labrador that takes part in the Christmas season, that's a very regionally specific practice. So in one community, they might have something that's called the hobby horse, which would kind of go along with mummers, but in another community, they might not have that. So it's representative based on where you are in the province or where you are in, whatever province you're in or whatever part of the world you're in. But it shows kind of what's important to that region. And when we say community-based, it's something that people recognize as being important and want to transmit it and want to continue what's happening in that community. So I already kind of touched on mummering, for example, and I also volunteer with the Mummers Festival in St. John's. And one thing that we've done is brought a mummers parade to St. John's, say, which has some, I guess, evidence in archival history. So there's some archival notes and some archival images of, say, a parade in the streets of St. John's for mummers. But it's something that we've kind of changed and made a bit more contemporary as well. So ICH is kind of all of these things, and it's a term that UNESCO uses to identify living heritage or folklore. In the next slide, if we can switch to that one, these are just kind of the different ways that UNESCO breaks down traditional skills and knowledge in different communities. So one of the things that we found when doing kind of these people, places, culture workshops is that if you bring kind of too much information to a community, it can be a bit overwhelming. And so rather than kind of using these 5 different domains, we decided to simplify it again and do people, places, and culture when we were working with communities. And so these are just kind of the way that they have them broken down. So we have oral history and traditions, including language. Certainly myself, like I mentioned, I'm here in Newfoundland and Labrador, and we have our own dictionary. So there's not many places across Canada that have their own dictionary for their own dialect. So oral expression and traditions are very important here. We have performing arts, and those could be things like theater, but they could also be, in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have a large tradition of, say, plays or skits or community concerts. And oftentimes, as part of that, they might include, say, a recitation or something like that. So this community knowledge passed down through performing it and through enacting it. The third one there is just social practices, rituals, and festival events. So for that, you can often think of things that take place throughout the year. So calendar customs, that would be kind of your holidays that come every year, whether they're Christian holidays or Jewish holidays, or holidays for any religion or any kind of you know practice. Those are kind of the things that happen every year. And there are also things, when we think about rituals, they're things that happen in life. So there's funerals, there's weddings, there's baptisms. So kind of these practices that happen again and again. One that I'm going to touch on a little bit later is so bonfire night for Newfoundland and Labrador. So that's November the 5th, and that's a date that's recognized as an important date in the province, and it's something that people I guess, celebrate by having a bonfire. And there's different reasons for having that bonfire, but it's one that comes up again and again every year. The fourth one there is knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe. So for this, we're thinking about um, basically people and their connection to their kind of nature and their natural surroundings. So whether that's having a particular berry patch or a trail that brings you to your wood cutting area. So it's basically that interaction with nature and what's happening in your surroundings. And then the fifth one is traditional craftsmanship. And our work with Heritage NL, we've been doing a lot of work around traditional craftsmanship over the past 2 years. We had a funding program where we were funding a mentor and apprentice pair to learn traditional skills and knowledge. So whether that was like creating a birch broom, making a birch broom, or weaving, we had kind of, I think there was over 40 pairs that were doing these traditional skills and knowledge. So those are kind of just to get you thinking about the broader assets in a community. But like I said, we simplified it a little bit down to make it a little bit easier to actually enact in a community. So we can move on to our next slide. So this is just some of the ways that these kind of thinking about these assets can be applicable in community or economic development. So the workshops are a practical and meaningful way to bring a community together to really figure out what is important to a community. So by doing this kind of cultural assets and figuring out what is important, you can figure out what the community values and what might also be used in economic development projects going forward. And it's also important because it can allow you to figure out if there's any points of contention or concern, things that people are particularly, I guess, passionate about, but could also potentially develop concerns in an engagement process. So the next slide, I'm just going to talk on kind of working through what the People Places Culture Workshop is. So this is just a picture of a gentleman. This is Ken Tuek. He's a fifth generation stonemason. And so Heritage NL had him do a few dry stone walling workshops. This is one in Brigus at Kent Cottage. And so when we talk about people, I'll just go to the next slide. So when we talk about the different people, when we go into a community, we want people to consider anybody in the community who has significant skills and knowledge. So maybe not just those people who might be, say, business owners or merchants or things like that, but people who also have traditional skills that are important. So like a stonemason. We also want to make sure that we include people who are alive. Oftentimes people think of people who have passed on, who had a lot of traditional skills and knowledge or important skills to pass on. And it's certainly we can keep keep a track or keep note of who were those important people, but we also want to make sure that we talk about people who are living and who are resources in the community today. So just some examples there. So say Vida Smith, who makes the best toutons. So toutons are like a fried bread dough, but things that you wouldn't necessarily think of if you're thinking about them in maybe an economic development, but if you're thinking about who is important in the community itself. So who knows how to make the best birch brooms, say James Miller, Aunt Sophie, who survived a shipwreck. So we could kind of capture some of those stories and maybe use those in like a storyboard or some sort of interpretation. Gus Mentions had the first gas station. So they're all important stories and they can be included on a map. Up next, we have places. So we can just quickly go through. So this is just in Cape Royal. This is a cemetery where we've done a bit of work on the headstones and headstone maintenance. So yeah, if we want to hop down to places, the next slide. So these can be both buildings and intangible, of course. So they could be heritage buildings, different shops in the community, places where people gather. So lodges or churches, community halls, um, fences and gates, shortcuts, places where wells were dug or community gardens were planted. So we want people thinking about all of the things in their community, all of the different places. I mentioned earlier, like maybe the best berry patch. Somebody's probably not going to write that on the map, but we want people to think about what's important in their community. So that could be natural spots like a rock, a stream, or a waterfall, fruit trees. And there might be old place names. So oftentimes when municipalities kind of incorporated, they might have, put official names on signs, but there might be old place names or local nicknames that are for specific locations or specific neighborhoods. I mentioned that I'm in St. John's, and I know that there's a map that's been done that has all of the different places in St. John's and all of the different neighborhoods written down. And so if you're looking at that, it doesn't mean anything. It's just a bunch of different names, but it's important for the people who live in those communities. So I live in Rabbittown, for example. So that's just one kind of section on that map. So it's just a way to connect like the community as a whole. We'll move on. Yeah. So I mentioned earlier just bonfire night. So this is just an image of an old chip that was to be burned. And so this was burnt on bonfire night. So we'll go down to culture. So like I mentioned at the beginning, these are traditions and customs and events that take place. So they could be a parade, a street party, pancake night. I don't know if anybody here is from Newfoundland and Labrador, but pancake night was last week, and I certainly had pancakes with some money in them. So just think about those traditional events that happen throughout the year or over time that are important to the community. So I mentioned Christmas mumming, seasonal activities like bird hunting, berry picking, things like that. They could be kind of haunted places. So in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have a lot of fairy stories. So there might be an area where there's fairies where people do not go. A spot where young couples would go for a first kiss. We've done some work in different communities where they've had a sitting rock or a kissing rock, and that's where growing up people would go and they'd have their first kiss. Favorite locations for picnics, different things like that. So when we do these events, you can head to the next slide. So we get people to map this directly onto three different maps. So what we'll usually do is we'll get everyone together, break everyone up into three groups roughly, and get people and each of those to think about the people in one section, the places, and the culture. And then we'll get people to swap around if there's time so that everyone gets a chance to kind of think about who else in the community. So the people that are important, put them down, the places where certain things took place, and the culture or the events that have happened. On our next slide, we'll see. So this one here just talks about usually when we go into a community and we do a one of these workshops, the people places culture workshop, what we'll do is give them a report. So uh, our organization is really from the ground up. So we want to learn from what people are telling us. We want to know who is important and why they're important. And so we'll kind of take notes throughout the People Places Culture Workshop and then give that back to the community as a way to decide what they want to do next. And the bottom here, you can just see that some of the benefits for this culture mapping, in particular in Change Islands, some of it was to create awareness of little known but important pieces of community history. So one of the examples that Change Islands brought up was this area where it was kind of like a natural bridge across the water. It was stones that people used to cross before there was a road put through, before there was an actual bridge there. And so that was something that they thought was important and something that they should recognize. The other ones there are contribute to heritage and cultural related activities and events. Contribute to drawing people into the community and sharing its local history and culture, so tourism and interpretive planning, and support employment and businesses in the area. So I've got two case studies that I'm going to touch on, and the first one is in New Perlican in Trinity Bay. And so you can just head to the next slide. Thank you. So this was a picture of one of the people, places, and culture events that we did there. And so the first night, what we did was meet with the community, like the larger community, and figure out some of the people in the community, the places, and the culture. So all of those assets and map them out. Once those were mapped out, what we did was we worked with the community the next day to figure out what was most important. Um, when we kind of met with this heritage committee, they had, I think it was something like 45 different ideas of different projects and different events that they wanted to do. And so we talked about, based on kind of this people, places, and culture workshop, what was most important to the community itself. And so they identified a few different things. If we go to the next slide, we'll see one of them. And so this was, they had, the community had, or the Heritage Committee had a piece of land that was given to them by the community, and they wanted to do something. They didn't have an exact plan in mind, but they had this piece of land and they wanted to do something for the community there. And so what they developed, we kind of worked with them on this. One of the things that they did was this heritage landing. And so all of the materials there and the build itself was donated. So the materials were donated by local folks, and then they built it again, but with local hands kind of putting it together. And so they've got kind of some interpretation on the history of the community. You can see that there's that little door on the right, and that door in the summer is open, and it's got kind of different artifacts behind it. So it's kind of like a pop-up museum. They swap out some of the artifacts that are in there. Also, they've got kind of fishing gear on it, as well as you can see like a fish splitting table. So in Newfoundland and Labrador, of course, if you're splitting a cod, that's up there as well. And they've made this into kind of a focal spot for the community. Next door, they have picnic tables and a spot for people to rest and stay. There's a little cafe up the road. And so it's become kind of a gathering spot for both, I guess, locals and tourists as well. So the next thing that they identified, yes, they had wanted to do something around oral history in the community. And when we were doing that People, Places, Culture workshop, one thing that kept coming up again and again were goats and the importance of goats to the community. And uh, myself and my coworkers were saying this isn't exactly typical. Certainly, there were goats in different parts of the province. People had, horse, sheep, goats, and whatnot. But the significance of the goats in the community, they were saying how they were used to haul wood. So they would have a goat or two, and they would bring them in the woods. They would haul wood with them. They would haul water sometimes. They were kept for milk or for meat. They would even like let you know when the weather was changing. When the goats came down and they got underneath the fish lakes, then you knew that rain was coming. You'd have to take in your clothesline. And so when all of these stories were coming up, we were saying this isn't exactly super typical. So it might be something that you might want to focus on. And so we work with them on an oral history project. So myself and a coworker went out and we interviewed, I think it was somewhere between 15 and 20 folks in the area who had memories of keeping goats, of having goats, of kind of the maintenance of goats, of using them to haul wood and all of that, and put together this little booklet. And this was a way to both preserve some of those stories. So we did oral history interviews, which were then placed online on a digital archive. And then we had the physical book. And we usually do a run of 100 books, which we did for the initial kind of event launch or book launch. And they all went. And I think they've done, I don't know, they sell them themselves. And I think they've done 4 or 5 runs of books since. And then they also sell kind of other small community books alongside that. So it's an interesting way to kind of capture some of that oral history in the area. I'll go to the next slide. So I'm just going to touch on this briefly. So one of the things that was identified in the People, Places, Culture workshop was that they have several different cemeteries in the community, one of which hasn't been kind of maintained. And so one of the things they wanted to do was figure out exactly how many headstones were there and how to preserve them in the best way. And so in partnership with Memorial University, we did some kind of work out there around exactly that, just how many how many headstones were there, how to preserve them. So they had some archaeology students and some archaeologists out doing some ground penetrating radar and figuring out exactly where everything was. On the next slide, we have, so again, kind of in doing this work, we, in partnership with MUN, they had the folklore field students. So every year in the folklore department, they have a field school. Unfortunately, this one was in during COVID time. So the plan was to have 10 students kind of billeted out in the community and there for about a month doing research and working with the community. But unfortunately, because of kind of COVID times, it was more of a virtual event. The next slide that we're on right now, so this is a workshop that was done out there. So you saw that Heritage Landing, that red building at the beginning. Right next to that, they had a space where they had some picnic tables. And because it kind of backed onto private property, one of the decisions that they wanted was to put a fence up. And so this was a workshop that was done there. So this was people paid and attended this workshop, and they learned how to make this traditional wriggle fence. And so two people in the community taught the workshop, and you can see some of the participants there. There's somebody there with a mallet in the back hammering one of the posts into the ground, and you can see people putting the wriggles or the kind of the pickets into the fence there. And so this was another way to, I guess, use some of the things that came out of that workshop and also make a space more usable. So this is where they have their picnic tables right next to the kind of cafe that's up the street. And we'll move on to my second case study. So this is in Salvage in Bonavista Bay. And so this building here is the Salvage Fishermen's Museum. And one of the things that Heritage NL does outside of kind of our intangible and cultural heritage is that we have a lot of different buildings. So we have 300 plus buildings around the province that are designated. And so the Fisherman's Building was one of the ones that was recently designated. So as part of the work in designating it, they got some funding to do some restoration of the building and keep it kind of traditional, but bring it up to good withstanding, so it'll last for a longer time. And so they received a grant for outside exterior restoration of the structure. And so in addition to that, we did some work in the community, which included a People Places Culture workshop. So if you go to the next slide, I had talked earlier about the importance of kind of local names and local community knowledge. And so here we have how the community, I guess, was broken up and how the different names were. The neighborhoods were named traditionally. And so this was something that we worked with the community on, just figuring out exactly where the different areas are. And so this is something that I think personally, as somebody who, if you're going to a different community, I love finding out what different names are. I love finding out kind of where different people lived and what the different areas were. And so this is just, again, a map that just brings that to the forefront. The other idea, if you want to go to the next slide, that came out was Salvage doesn't have much in the way of foods. There are not very many eateries in the community. And so one of the ideas was if the local museum is open in the summer, one of the ways to kind of keep people in the area would be through a museum mug up. So you can see on the slide, on the right-hand side, just some of the imagery there. So the image that's kind of across the left there, that's a piggin, it would have been traditionally for bailing water out of a boat. And so those four different images there, I think the first three are from, they have several piggins in the in the museum itself. And so one of the ideas was that since they have this on display, it's something that's in their museum and it's something that people kind of come in and they see as they go through. It's a good way to incorporate that into the museum and have people buy a mug up or have a bite to eat while in the area. And so what you could do is you could pack your mug up or your lunch in a piggin, go for a picnic in the area. There's certain trails. I'm going to touch on that in a minute. And then the hope would be that maybe somebody was interested enough that they might want to buy a piggin, kind of buy that at the gift shop and take it home, or buy certain things that are kind of linked to the museum in the gift shop and take that home. The next images we have are so they have a trail, um, I guess a kind of connections of trails happening in the area. And so they've done some work on connecting them and getting them, developing them a little bit more. And so one of the things that they did in the community was a trail festival. So it's called the Damnable Trail. And so on the next slide, you can see they have some merchandise available for purchase when you come through the area. These are available on their website as well. And then in the next slide, we have just the festival schedule. So there's the guided tours, guided hikes, and this is all kind of tied in with the community itself and tied in with what's already there. And then again, as part of the trail kind of festival, they have where to stay in the community and where to eat. And so that's why, like I mentioned earlier, that pagan idea that take a lunch is another way to kind of bring a food spot to the area, because as I mentioned, Salvage doesn't have much of that itself right now. Then the last few slides that I have here. So this is just kind of, we have on our website and online just a how to do a people, places, culture workshop. It's something that we find important, and we find is a good way, like I said, to kind of, um, it's a great tool to figure out what is in a community and how they can use that. And so we've created just kind of a simple how-to guide for folks who would like to do it in their own community. And then I'm going to touch on in this last slide, or second last slide, just some of the other things that we do as part of our intangible cultural heritage work. And so on the left here, we see a group of seniors. And so one of the things that we'll do is a memory mug up. I mentioned the Goats of New Perlican earlier. And so oftentimes, if we're in a community, in addition to doing kind of a people, places, culture workshop, we'll do a memory mug up. So we were in Wareham last week, or Centerville Trinity Wareham last week, and we were there as part of their Winter Carnival Festival. And so we had a memory mug up, and there were 60 seniors and, well, it was 60 people, about 50 seniors and 10 students, which was really, really sweet. And so what we did there is everyone got a chance to kind of say their name, say where they were from. And because we had so many people that we really only got a chance to hear like a story at a time. A smaller group, certainly you'd hear more stories, but in that area, we were really focusing on where people grew up, because it was such an area that where people came in from islands that were resettled. So a lot of people were really focusing on where they grew up and what that, what that particular island was like. But we find memory mug-ups are a really great way to figure out a little bit more about what's important in the community or what might come up in the community. A few years back, we did a run of kind of a big project that was called the Oral History Roadshow. And so we did 10 of these memory mug-ups in 10 different communities across the province. And each community kind of focused on a different event, a different topic. Oftentimes when we're working with communities, particularly if we're working with like a heritage group in a community, they'll have a lot of ideas of what to do, which is really, really great. But what we found is when we focus it in, that's really where we find you get the most out of it, because you can um, do a lot more kind of research and a lot more information on one particular topic as a way to get you started. So for that Oral History Roadshow, we did, for example, in Cartwright in Labrador, they wanted to focus on crafts. And so that mug up was all about crafts in the community. And I interviewed a bunch of different folks in the community, all about traditional crafts in that community. Port Blandford, they wanted to touch on the shops in the community. And so they have some kind of historical signage around town, but they also had 44 different shops in a community that is not very big. And so that is something that they wanted to work on recognizing and do some work around. So we find memory mug-ups are a really good way, in addition to kind of that people, places, culture, to focus in on a particular topic and get some. It's a great way to identify people in the community who have those stories, who might be good storytellers, who might be people that you do kind of a one-on-one interview with, and either you use that for, say something like a book, or something like historical interpretation, whether that's in person or like an interpretive panel or something like that. And then the next image there on the right-hand side is of another event that we do, which we just call a scanning party. In all of our work, we include food, because people will come out if there's food. And so a scanning party is we have food, like we have tea and cookies at the back. And what we do is we ask people to bring pictures. So oftentimes, a lot of the groups that we work with, they might have a selection of photos, but they might be looking for something in particular. This image comes from Carboneer, where they had some older images, but they were really interested in kind of older images of the community. And so what we did was had this scanning party. So people came out with their image with their books. So they had an album of images, or they had a handful of images that were of old Carbonear, and then we scanned them in. And what that meant was they took their images home at the end of the day, but they also took a copy of their images digitally. So they had just like a thumb drive with their images digitally, which then they could share kind of online or with their family members. But then the community in this particular group, it was a 50 plus club that we were working with. So they ended up with, it was a partnership between the 50 plus club and the heritage community. So they ended up with a selection of images from the historical kind of Carbonear. So those are just two other examples of ways that when we're working with communities, we can think about using the assets that are already there and figuring out who are important people to talk to in the community. That's about it for me. I know I had about 20 minutes or so, so I guess I will turn it back over to Jonathan, who I believe will lead the Q&A.
Thank you. So much great information. You know, what I really love is the aspect of, especially when you were sharing those last two pieces of how you capture the history and the story. I love that idea, of the using a mug up or something to bring people together. And you're absolutely right. If there's food, people will come. So amazing, because I think that I look at some of the other places where we work, and much of that history is very fragile. I find it's, if we don't put the effort into protecting and preserving it, and sharing it, and I think celebrating it, we risk losing it. So yeah, very, very well done. So we've got some questions here. If anybody wants to unmute, or I will take them in over in the chat, but feel free to fire away. Nicole.
All right. Thank you so much, Terra. That was wonderful. I greatly appreciate it. I'm going to second what Michelle put in the chat there. I do believe that was Michelle. If I said the name wrong, I'm sorry. But I also would like to know about having Heritage NL coming to our community to do such a people, cultures, place workshop, and how do we go about that?
Sure. So I'm just going to get it up on my uh, browser here, and then I'll put it in the chat. But on our
Awesome.
website, we have just kind of a rundown of what it is. And I will say, because we're a Crown Corporation, we don't get a whole lot of funding for travel. And so one thing that we'll usually ask folks to do is if there's a way to kind of provide accommodation. So when we went to Change Islands, we were kind of put up and fed a little bit. So that is kind of put into the last part of this. If you can put us up, then we can come probably.
That sounds
So
fair.
so the link is there in the chat, but it's just under our programs. There you go. Somebody has 5 rooms in their Airbnb. So it's yeah, like I said, we're pretty busy moving, but usually when we're on the move, like I said, we were in Centerville and we we're on last week. We also went over to Grand Bank. So when we're on the move, we'll kind of put a few things into one trip. So that's the link there. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We were privileged enough to have a headstone preservation workshop in Pilley's Island quite some time ago.
Yes.
So that was really nice. And had I known you could do the people called place and cultures, we would have done it at the same time while you were
Yes.
out.
Yeah.
But that's okay. We'll have you back. I love, again, like Jonathan said, the mug ups and scanning parties. That sounds fantastic. Why work smarter, not harder, right?
Yes.
So that's
And
fantastic.
like I brought up the kind of how-to guide for the people, places, and culture, and we also have those done up for the scanning parties and the mug ups. Like, it's a simple thing that communities can do,
Yeah.
and certainly use it, do it yourself. I mean, if you want a hand, certainly reach out, but we also encourage communities, if they want to do a memory mug up and call it a memory mug up, go for it. We just want communities involved and engaged in what's happening in their communities, involved in their heritage and their history. So yeah, go for it.
Absolutely. My last comment before I let you go and let somebody else take a turn is that I'm the chair for our regional Tourism Association here in Green Bay. And I am definitely gonna be doing the mapping thing of people, places, and culture. I'm definitely going to be implementing that and having the people gather and do that swap out map. I'll make sure I have a full day of just that so I can get lots of information. Thank you so much,
Sounds
Tara.
good. Thank you.
Thank you. Great points. I want to come out and do that mapping with you, Nicole. Other questions, comments? One of the things that, and we're about to dive into this massive community development initiative that we're starting. And one of the things that we've recognized over the past number of years is our, at times, not, I think, respecting the people in the community that really hold the community together. We generally have this piece where, we bring the hotelier, the restaurateur, all of this. But what I really like about what you talked about today, Terra, was much of those connectors that pull community together. You don't necessarily see them in these types of economic development community meetings. They're the guy that is the guide out on the river, or is fishing, or the quilters, or the volunteers that exist. So what I really like about this is that you've been able to pull this together in a way to demonstrate not only the value for the community, but also the opportunity from an economic development perspective. Because what we've learned is that when visitors come to places, whether it be New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland and Labrador, they're coming for our people and our places. And it's not just about snapping a beautiful picture of the Miramichi River. They want to talk to Chantal. They want to talk to, and hear those insane stories of what it was like, to pull these massive salmon out of the Miramichi River. And to me, I think this is a great piece to learn from what Heritage NL has done on how do you collect those stories, how do you preserve those stories, and how do you bring them into your conversations as community development. That it isn't necessarily completely about economics. It's about your community and where you want to go with your community. So I applaud you on that. It's one of those things where, I always look, and you look around to these meetings when you have them and you're like, okay, we didn't necessarily get the real connectors of the community. We got lots of the business people, but I think it makes us look at our communities a little bit differently moving forward. I know we're coming up close to the hour. Anybody else have any final sort of comments or questions they want to ask? Do you travel outside of Newfoundland and Labrador?
That's what I was thinking, Jonathan.
Sure, in theory, yeah.
I'm thinking for St. Martin's. I just thank you. The ideas I have now, and the mug up, and getting the community involvement. And then when Jonathan mentioned quilting, we have a lovely quilting group here in St. Martin's. I don't quilt, but I can certainly go and listen, right, and capture stories. And filmmaking is one of my other hats. So from a filmmaker standpoint, I'm like, oh my gosh, the interviews would be incredible, right? Just getting people, on camera or just on audio, right? If they're not comfortable on camera, and capturing those stories in their voice.
Excellent. Great point, Elaine.
And that's one of the things that we really love. Like, we do a lot of oral history interviews, generally audio, just because of the size of video, and there's only like 4 people in our office. So if we're doing a lot of video work, then it's a lot of, it can be time consuming. But we do like to do audio recordings. And then when we do them, we have a partnership in place with Memorial University, and they have an online archive. It's called the Digital Archives Initiative. So any of these, so like that GOAT project, for example, all of the interviews that were done for that are on the digital archive. So you can listen to the full hour-long interview, which most people certainly aren't going to, but we love to kind of capture those and place those in a way that they can be accessed publicly, and so anybody can kind of go in and have a listen.
That's great. They're like podcasts, right? So
Which we do as well.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking, like you're saying, with the bandwidth that you need for video, these, you know, vignette podcasts would be amazing. Yeah.
Any other comments or questions? Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for taking time out. I apologize for some technical issues this morning, but so be it. You know what? I figure by 2 more years, maybe I'll have figured out the whole Zoom thing, or maybe we won't need it any longer. But Terra, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate that. The link she put up in there to Heritage NL, if you want to have a look at it. As I said, we've used Heritage NL so much, you know, for the great examples they have done for the problems in Newfoundland and Labrador, but of what we can learn on how we might be able to do things elsewhere as well. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day, and hopefully we'll see you on some of the next Sandbox sessions. Cheers.
Thank you.